Okay.
All right, we're live streaming. Woo!
Waiting for it. I do like not having to use OBS or
Okay.
at all. So let's. Oop. But check. Okay. Yep. We're live.
Great.
All right. Oof.
Bless you.
Thanks.
Who's that? Is that you, Doug?
Yep.
Man, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I got a really nasty cold myself, and that was after having COVID.
Everybody's sick or getting off of being sick or have been sick for the last month. My wife just found out she got a sinus infection and is like just now on antibiotics.
Mm.
Almost didn't go. I was like, "You've been sick for a month and a half, dear. You just go, okay?" She's like, "They're not going to give me anything. They're going to give you something." Yeah, they do. She said nurses make the worst patients. And they do. So, welcome back to our Hegel class. For those watching, we had just got done or roughly done with quality, although our summing up was probably kind of rough. And it's been 2 weeks plus Christmas and New Year's and, you know, all of the festivity holidays and all that crap. So I thought coming back that I would focus on a few, just reading out a few things to give it, just to give us some of our perspective back. I haven't finished it, but I have been reading this book called The Philosopher of Freedom by Klaus Fiveg, and it's been out in German for a few years already, but it finally dropped in English. And if anyone's interested, it's the big colorful one with all the pictures of Hegel. And yeah, there you go. And one of the things I realized while I'm in the midst of the Jena section, meaning while he's living there and writing the phenomenology of spirit, is that long before he actually sat down and wrote out the science of logic, he already sort of had the general outlines of what it is to be so, you know, sort of the idea of being like being and then going out going out into nature and coming back to oneself, and coming back to oneself is sort of constituting what Geist, what spirit really consists of in the human experience. And you'll, I mean, I'm sure you all have noticed this already, but this runs parallel throughout his work. That sort of movement is not just shows up in the macro. You know, you've got the logic and then the nature and then Geist, um, philosophy. You know, the 1, 2, 3. But it also shows up in the logical movements. Okay, so you've got the immediate, and then you've got determinate being, which sort of goes out and it's the negative. And then you come back to oneself and you become being for self, right? And that's just in micro, right? And those movements repeat themselves constantly throughout his system, all the way to the end of spirit. It's not just the logic, it's not just the nature. And so it's, I thought it would be very apropos to read from the preface to the phenomenology, 2 of these passages that I thought were really just, it's not going to capture all of it, but I think it really gave me a great flavor. And it's less than a page, and I just wanted to read it out if that's all right with you guys, because it
Yeah.
kind of recages us, gives us a bit more perspective. So this is on page 21 of the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's 36 in the preface. He says, the immediate existence of spirit, consciousness, contains the two moments of knowing and the objectivity negative to knowing. Since it is in this element of consciousness that spirit develops itself and explicates its moments, these moments contain that antithesis, and they all appear as shapes of consciousness. The science of this pathway is the science of the experience which consciousness goes through. He's describing the movement through the phenomenology. The substance and its movement are viewed as the object of consciousness, sort of outside of the I, at least at this stage, right? Consciousness knows and comprehends only what falls within its experience. For what is contained in this is nothing but spiritual substance, and this too as object of the self. But spirit becomes object because it is just this movement of becoming an other to itself, i.e., becoming an object to itself, and of suspending this otherness. And experience is the name we give to just this movement, in which the immediate, the unexperienced, i.e., the abstract, whether it be of sensuous but still unsensed being, or only thought of as simple, becomes alienated from itself and then returns to itself from this alienation, and is only then revealed for the first time in its actuality and truth, just as it then has become a property of consciousness also. Okay, that's 36. This is 37, and then I'll be done. We can talk. The disparity which exists in consciousness between the I and the substance, which is its object, is the distinction between them, the negative in general. Okay, this can be regarded as the defect of both, though it is their soul, or that which moves them. That is why some of the ancients conceived the void as the principle of motion, for they rightly saw the moving principle as the negative, though they did not as yet grasp that the negative is the self. Now, although this negative appears at first as a disparity between the I and its object, it is just as much the disparity of the substance with itself. Thus, what seems to happen outside of it, to be an activity directed against it, is really its own doing, and substance shows itself to be essentially subject. When it has shown this completely, spirit has made its existence identical with its essence. It has itself for its object just as it is, and the abstract element of immediacy and of the separation of knowing and truth is overcome. Being is then absolutely mediated. It is a substantial content which is just as immediately the property of the I. It is self-like, or the notion. With this, the phenomenology of spirit is concluded. What spirit prepares for itself in it is the element of true knowing. In this element, the moments of spirit now spread themselves out in that form of simplicity, which knows its object as its own self. They no longer fall apart into the antithesis of being and knowing, but remain in the simple oneness of knowing. They are the true in the form of the true, and their difference is only the difference of content. Okay, only the difference of content. Their movement, which organizes itself in this element into a whole, is logic or speculative philosophy. And then that brings that to an end. And it really, like, he's talking about the movement of consciousness in there, and the content of the phenomenology, but he also shows us in the movement the elements that are carried over into the logic in the exact form that they come in. The sort of going out and alienating from oneself's being, and then coming back as I don't even want to say a whole, but a fully knowing being returning to oneself. And really the phenomenology, I think, when we talk about monism and how there's only one reality, one of the biggest things the phenomenology does at the end of it, if you follow it like Hegel wants you to, is realize that there's not two worlds, there's not a duality, a subject world and object world that has a big fence around each, and you can't cross except by guessing, with a pair of binoculars. You realize that you are nature, right? And you're subject to the same laws as the objects around you. You are that object, but you're also subject. You are substance and subject. And he brings that up um, specifically, but it's really in the logic that he grounds the reality that substance is subject. So I'll leave it there. Discuss.
Yeah, that kind of was what I was. It's kind of interesting because I've been kind of noticing that kind of back and forth a little bit because trying to figure out how in quality we saw how being and kind of went back and forth. It's like it was always a form of being, and then there's an abstraction of this new determination, which then you realize what does that look like in a form of being, which in itself then turns out to be something else. And that's yeah, back and forth. I guess it does make a lot of sense at that point.
Yeah. And if you're one of his students and you're in the class and you're aware of the first work, you already have in outline a lot of the logic that goes into how all this stuff works. But if you just come to the science of logic first, or even the encyclopedia first, and you're like, okay, why is he going in this order? And there's a passage in here, and I can't remember which one it is, but he basically tells you, look, okay, our goal is to ground the subject as substance. Okay, that it's big argument in Jena circles in the late 18th century and early 19th century as to what grounds human experience, being itself, and so on and so forth. And you've got people critiquing Kant from Fichte to Schelling to, and you've got the Schlegel brothers, I think, erring more on the experience side, I believe, although I've only read a couple of those passages a couple of times. I can't remember. But anyway, at the end of the day, Hegel, it's not like this stuff just sprung fully formed from his mind in Jena or even later. Like the broad strokes were already roughly there right when he got there, because there had already been discussions going on while he was living in Bern or Frankfurt, or was Frankfurt after? I forget. Anyway, he's got a long itinerary through, non-unified Germany from Württemberg all the way to Berlin. Um,
Well, Hegel was really arguing against many of the basic premises of what might be called modern epistemology, going back to Descartes and Locke. In modern epistemology, they dealt with problems like the problem of the external world, problem of the minds, the problem of causality, and so forth. And Hegel's analysis of the relationship between subject and object basically dissolves the whole problem of the external world, because basically Hegel says, properly understood, there's really no distinction between subject and object.
And one of the genius points that Hegel introduces is the fact that philosophy up to then doesn't need to be jettisoned. You don't have to throw out any of these babies with bathwater at all. He says there's a connectivity between them all from ancient times all the way to today. But many others in Jena were basically like in competition with each other, and that you had to reject this form or that form or that form. Hegel said, no, 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 it's all right, but all the jigsaw pieces have to be put in the proper order in order to read the fully connected determinations in their relations with each other. Like it's one reality. So going back to Marx, he's trying to detail the capitalist system to you. It's not like he can throw out any element of experience that he comes across. He throws out a great deal of universals. basically political economists who say that in general, here is where surplus value comes from. And you can say this and this and this. He throws out a lot of the mistaken universals and instead grounds a more properly conceived determination of surplus value based on the individual or particular experiences within the capital circuit. Like he gives them a material grounding as opposed to just guessing in some cases, like Smith and Ricardo, based on previous models, like centering agriculture as the dominant production model, or the later factory system, and so on and so forth. It's all a matter of placing, I think, philosophy, going back to Hegel, the philosophical determinations in either the universal, the individual, or the particular spot on the syllogism, and then recaging them, I guess, so that they're properly connected where they should be, as opposed to just being a catch-all. Because the big competition between everyone in Jena is who can fill out a proper universal of the absolute that is filled with the individual in particular instances that fully ground it, like for real. And everybody kept getting that wrong. So, yeah. Or I'm not going to say they got it wrong, but whatever their goals, whatever their methods were that they used to create what they thought the absolute was, from Jacobi, who centers God, for instance, Kant goes for the judgments, and how all that stuff works, the categorical imperative, otherwise known as the tyrannical categorical, or however Klaus in his new book put it. People used to look at Kant's categorical imperatives as sort of like mini tyrants, like you had to obey each one of the mini tyrants, like it's a law, an iron law. And of course, Hegel, well, not just Hegel, but Fichte and Schelling and a few other people were like, hey, wait a minute, what about this stuff? So.
Think about what else I read up on. That was starting to go just to kind of refresh myself on Holgate's from quality to quantity section, but I didn't get through it all today. Although the only thing I've gotten so far kind of relates back to earlier is like, well, how he describes how in order for being to become a moment, it eventually is that the impurification of being itself creates a process that being is a moment of. So as such, it is both by being the moment, becoming the moment, and then being part of that process is itself. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to sort of help this along a little, I'm going to read out two other things real quick, because I think it helps as well. So this is page 81 of the Science of Logic. It's just section 1, determinateness, quality. So he writes, and this is really short, he says, being is the indeterminate immediate. It is free from determinateness in relation to essence, and also from any which it can possess within itself. This reflectionless being is being as it is immediately in its own self alone. There's the first small paragraph. And he says, Because it is indeterminate being, it lacks all quality. But in itself, the character of indeterminateness attaches to it only in contrast to what is determinate or qualitative. But determinate being stands in contrast to being in general, so that the very indeterminateness of the latter constitutes its quality. But notice you can't know this until after you've gotten to determinate being and have something to compare it to, right? See how that works? You get to the end of the logical derivation, and then you look back, and then you realize what sheer being in its full unfolding actually was, right? So you've got that. It will therefore be shown that the first being is in itself determinate. That's a result, okay? And therefore, secondly, that it passes over into determinate being is determinate being, but that this latter as finite being sublates itself and passes over into the infinite relation of being to its own self, that is, thirdly, into being for self. So you've got the three determinations of quality here. You've got sheer being, you've got determinate being, and then you've got being for self, okay? And you can't really see the full unfolding of the dialectic until you get to the end of it and look back and compare being for self to determinate being, and being for self to sheer being, and also determinate being again to being, right? Suddenly you see the bird's wings and it full, fully unfolded. Suddenly you can see the bird flying, the owl of Minerva flying, right? Whereas before you're basically zoomed in on one of the parts, right? And on the one hand, this small paragraph, 2 paragraphs that he's got here, seems very simple. He's just narrating what's going to happen to sheer being at the end of the determination before we get to quantity. But he also does a couple other things, some of which I've already talked about. He's talked about the fact that sheer being does have a determinateness. It does, even though it starts out as indeterminate, right? At the end of it, it turns out to be what it is in its truth. Again, paralleling what he's saying here, right? Except in miniature, right? Does that make sense? So you have to read it backwards once you get to the end. And in that way, you can say that, gosh, how do I put it? The right word is necessity or necessary, okay? So you have sheer being, you have determinate being, and you have being for self. And being for self eventually morphs into quantity at the very end. And one thing you can say about quantity is that it shows that I'm going to flub this. Quality is a necessary determination and all its subdeterminations, right? Quality is a necessary state of being or process. If you're even going to have quantity, if you come across a quantity in any way, shape, or form, right? There are qualities. There's a something already there. There's a being for self that's already there in a determination that already exists, that grounds that quantity. Does that make sense? Grounds the quantity. So from there, I'm just going to turn to page 185 really quick because it's the very next section paragraph, and it's a little longer, but of course it's a little longer because we've just gone through all of quality. So he says, the difference between quantity and quality has been stated. Quality is the first immediate determinateness. Quantity is the determinateness which has become indifferent to being, a limit which is just as much no limit, being for self, which is absolutely identical with being for other. a repulsion of the many ones, which is directly the non-repulsion, the continuity of them. Because that which is for itself is now posited as not excluding its other, right? Rather in unity with it. But rather as affirmatively continuing itself into it. It is otherness insofar as determinate being, again, appears in this continuity, and its determinateness is at the same time no longer in a simple self-relation, no longer an immediate determinateness of the determinately existent something, but is posited as self-repelling, as in fact having the relation to self as determinateness in another something, which is for itself. Whew. And since they are at the same time indifferent, relationless limits reflected into themselves, the determinateness is in general is outside itself, right? An absolutely self-external determinateness and an equally external something. Such a limit, the indifference of the limit within itself and of the something to the limit, constitutes the quantitative determinateness of the something. Okay, a lot of this sounds like word salad the first time you come across it, but you notice how he says that the determinateness in general is outside itself, an absolutely self-external determinateness. So you remember in the Encyclopedia Logic, we got to the very end with the absolute idea, very end, right? And it turned out that the absolute idea was actually an underdetermination of nature, and that the absolute idea externalizes itself out into nature. This is a similar shape, okay? Determinateness at the end of quality, determinateness and quality self-externalizes itself into the new realm of quality in which it's sublated. Another way of saying this is that nature contains the absolute idea, sublated into it as a moment. The entirety of the logic is contained within nature, right? It's actualized, self-externalized. Another way of saying it is natural forms, certain natural forms, i.e. spirit, contain in their in toto, right? The entirety of this. This exists in nature in certain forms, us, right? Going back to this determination here, that's exactly parallel. He's saying that quality, determinateness, is in its full articulation is contained in quantity. So if you come across a determination that's quantitative, you can already assume, being familiar with this, that quality is a moment, and that all of its qualitative determinations are involved in that. In fact, you can probably go down the list and find, someone gives you a quantitative determination of some kind, like I have 5 apples, and you can immediately say about that determination several things about it that include, and just go down the list. What do we have? We have sheer being, we have nothing, we have becoming, we have determinate being, we have all of those shapes that we just went through. And you can say something about all of those, and indeed, after going through this and seeing what logically necessitates the next thing, and what's necessary for a determination, you can say intelligent things about that. Not to put it in too abstract a sense, but when you get to when you get to something like what's something that we use often. A lot of these we don't use terribly often, like in just normal speech, but like infinity. What does infinity require? What is necessary for infinity to even be a cogent category. Everything before it, you know, can be counted as a determination that's necessary for the full discussion of infinity, if that makes sense. Can't talk about infinity unless you fully discuss all the determinations that make it up. Whether they're immediately on the surface, like tangible, or they're simply implicitly there. In other words, sublated but not immediate, more mediated, you know.
In fact, in terms of being the further determination of being for itself requires the externalizing or coming out of determinate being itself, which through that process to illustrate itself it's a being for one, right?
Yeah, being for self in its full articulation is the return of being to itself after being help me out here, after going out into its other. Determinate being is the negative, it's the other of sheer being. And then being for self is the return to itself as the full concept of quality, the full self, the full concept, of determinateness. So, there are a couple different like layers to how you can discuss even these early moments, and I think Hegel does a good job of doing that. But I also think one cannot get the full picture of what it is, what being for self is as a concept, right, of the whole, until later when he actually talks about what concept is in the third book, which is why if you just stop in the first and you take those to be determinations from which you can derive conclusions about being, about becoming, about all those things, you're going to end up in all the mistakes I think that the German idealists ended up like dead ending, right? You have to get through the whole system, or at least the logic itself, in order to get to I don't know, fully realize everything. The the dialectic, you may be able to abstract the three big laws of the dialectic like Engels did, and I'm saying that, and it sounds like when you read it in the dialectics of nature, you're kind of like, okay, what? Hang on a second. Let me find this real quick. It was like right on. Okay, dialectics in Engels, yeah, dialectic in Engels' dialectic of nature. So, all right. This is Alex. This is Alex's. He just sent this out, Kyle, a day or two ago. He says, in the dialectics of nature, Engels writes that the laws of dialectics are abstracted from nature and human society, for they are nothing but the most general laws of these two aspects of historical development, as well as of thought itself. And indeed, they can be reduced to three. Number one, the law of transformation of quantity into quality, and vice versa. The law of the interpenetration of opposites, and the law of the negation of the negation. He then goes on to explain how all three were developed by Hegel, the first one in part one of his logic, the doctrine of being. So the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa. The second, in the second part of the logic, the doctrine of essence. And you notice this, he says the law of the interpenetration of opposites. And we look at essence and you see that the opposites are never alone. There's always one with the other. They're never alone. And they interpenetrate as opposed to being antinomies. Let's see. And the third, he says, figures as the fundamental law in the construction of the system, the law of the negation of the negation. And Alex goes on. But even just reading those off the page of Engels' notes on the dialectics of nature it doesn't quite give you the full flavor of how these things interact. The three laws interact within the context of deriving the logic, deriving nature, and deriving spirit. Like, it's basically why he says the preface is almost a waste of time, because you have to read the book to see how they interact correctly. Let's see here. I'm going to read the rest of this section real quick. It's page 185 again. I stopped halfway down. It says, in the first place, pure quantity is to be distinguished from itself as a determinate quantity from quantum. As the former, it is in the first place real being for self, which is returned into itself, again with the movement, and which as yet contains no determinateness. So it's in its immediate stage, a compact infinite unity which continues itself into itself. Secondly, this develops, and here we're on quantity. Secondly, this develops a determinateness, determinate being part two of the movement of three, which is posited in it as one which is at the same time no determinateness, as only an external one. It becomes quantum. Quantum is indifferent determinateness, that is, a self-transcending, self-negating determinateness. As this otherness of otherness, it relapses into the infinite progress, which we saw in quality, the infinite, sort of the bad infinity, I should say. But the infinite quantum is the indifferent determinateness sublated. It is the restoration of quality. And so you come to the end of part two. Thirdly, quantum in a qualitative form is quantitative ratio. Quantum transcends itself only generally. In ratio, however, its transition into its otherness is such that this otherness, in which it has its determination is at the same time posited, is another quantum. Thus, quantum has returned into itself, and in its otherness is related to itself. So you notice the one and the many is now in the first set of threes has mutated into these two quantums that are hang on. Yeah, two quantums that are related to each other, i.e. the ratio. We know what a ratio is, number slash number. Both of those are quantums related to each other. Thus, quantum has returned into itself, and its otherness on the other side of the dash is related to itself, right? It's kind of cool, huh? So at the base of this ratio, there is still the externality of quantum. The quanta which are
Joe powers.
Sorry, why is this thing auto playing? I don't know.
And this is what
So I was just trying to get back to the transcript of Holgate's on this section.
Yeah. No, you're
Okay.
fine. So just to finish this out, at the base of this ratio, there is still the externality of quantum. The quanta which are related to each other are indifferent. That is, they have their self-relation in such a self-externality. The ratio is thus only a formal unity of quality and quantity. Its dialectic is its transition into their absolute unity and to measure, and thus ends quantity. And he's summarizing where we're going in our reading, which we haven't gone yet. But you can see, hopefully you can see at this point some of the shapes that have already and transitions that have already appeared in general in quality in the form of quantity. Does some of that look familiar, guys? Jim, Doug, Kyle?
Mm-hmm.
A little bit.
Ideal logic of quantity is quantity exhibits structure of being for self or self-relatedness.
I'm not going to read the remark below that because he gets into some detail about some of that other stuff. And what I really just wanted to highlight while reading this, because as we go forward, a lot of this is going to get a lot more complicated, but you can sort of see the general outlines of how this is going to work. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, all the way to the end. And those three determinations are articulate themselves both at a micro and a macro level. So you have the three books: being, essence, concept, right? And at the micro level, you have that same articulation of being, essence, and concept being repeated all throughout the logic, in which you're just what do I want to say? Even trying to say it out loud, I immediately falsify it, because if I tell you it's, you move from being to determinate being to being for self, that's basically the being, essence, and concept triad. But they're not defined. I want to say this. They're not defined beforehand. He says, clear your mind. You can't anticipate that you're going to get to the next transition. In fact, anticipating it spoils the actual logical determination. The only thing you're allowed to think is everything that's behind you, right? And the only thing we have behind us at sheer being is basically that subject and object are actually the same things, which this book just finished proving, right? But with his method, he also said, when you start the logic, you can't start with the entirety of the content of the phenomenology in mind when you're looking at sheer being. It's all sublated, but it's also fully mediated, fully abstracted. Being defined as the subject and object, the subject knowing itself as the object, right? It's just being to start with, that abstract form. From that beginning, and that's the only beginning you have to worry about, you can begin to derive the science of thought, and then from there go in that general direction. I mean, you go in that general direction, but in reading it, you cannot assume that you will. But you will, because the book was written a couple hundred years ago, so we already know that. But when Hegel was writing it, I'm pretty sure by the time Hegel wrote the finished product, he'd already finished this, or even before he had finished this, he was already working out how it all worked and sort of the rough parameters, right? Subject, object, the I. The I was supposed to be the beginning that Fichte gave us in critiquing Kant. And I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop talking right now because I'm sure other people have things to say. I thought I would have nothing to say tonight, and now I have too much to say, because there's just like. And Doug, you finished Klaus's book, so you read the Jena section. You know what I'm talking about roughly. The
Roughly, yeah.
history of trying to get to that point. Yeah.
So
It's fascinating to me that it reminded me of Marx's getting to where he finished Capital. Like it's jumble, it's a mess, right? You have some ideas of the absolute, in other words, the result at the end of the system, already in mind before you try to systematize it. But how do you get the exposition right, that it's not just like a PowerPoint presentation, but it actually displays the logical necessity cleared away from all of the other stuff? Like that took years. Like, boggles my mind how you could do it and keep it all in order, and not like sabotage yourself. Any thoughts? I'll shut up now. So someone else talk, or I
I
don't
was
know.
gonna say, so I haven't got that far into the biography yet, but they did talk about the being in itself being
Yeah,
being one. Because I was just checking because I did recall, and I went back and did look at the transcript. So Holgate, when he was talking about quantity, does talk about that where he ends on quantity. Obviously, we're not there yet, but quantity ends with the square, and that is in a way of the number being for itself at the very end, because it is in a
that's
way,
cool.
yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, that's that's droll. uh, yeah. I'm not a very great maths guy, but I can at least see, like, impressionistically, I get it.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
One at the beginning of, and then quantity or number becoming for itself at the end. That's what interesting is that Hegel thinks there's something in the very fabric of being that makes squared numbers necessary. And then nature somehow, like, the square law of gravity, but etc.
Yeah,
He tied it over to that.
yeah, and if you start reading into the nature, you also realize that the determinations that get you from, like, a point to a line to a plane to a 3D object in space, you can't just assume these things just because material reality exists. You have to be able to show the logical necessity that makes, that makes the line, the point, and the plane necessary determinations to even make out a 3D object in space, right? Like they imply it. It's in the very line. You look at the line of a computer monitor or a coffee cup, right? And you see the two-dimensional lines that make them up with your vision, right? And the curves, and you realize that it's made up of these lesser determinations in nature, right? And and this is how you visualize what's going on in the logic, which takes place only in the mind. You look at an object in nature, right? Before you get returned to spirit, which is here, right? You look out in nature and you realize that all of the determinations that make later determinations necessary, you can see in concrete form the lesser determinations, and see how they're integrated into like the line is integrated into the 3D object, right? You can see it concretely with your eyes. You can conceptualize it. And if you abstract that sort of movement of realizing the necessity, the logical determinations in thought, in the logic, suddenly stand out like one of those 3D picture puzzle pic. You've all seen the 3D puzzle pictures they gave us when we were kids, that have like the yeah, your eyes have to work correctly, and then you see the bird of prey um in the I forget what they call it. It was like the amazing 3D
Magic
whatever.
eye.
Yeah, magic eye, right.
Yeah.
Suddenly it stands out, like, okay, there it is.
I
And you
always
start,
cheated at those though, so but I have a lazy eye, that's why.
how can you cheat?
I have a lazy eye.
Okay,
I can make the eye go out just enough to be exactly 1 point.
nice. Okay. Yeah, I always had to work at those at first. But yeah, so these reading these determinations is sort of a twofold proposition. First, you go through um, the logical order that he gives us in the book, and then you read, and then you look back and see that you can draw conclusions about the earlier determinations. One of the conclusions he draws in the very paragraph I read a little while ago, he said that sheer being in its indeterminateness actually has a determinateness, right? But you can't know that until you've gone past that point and can look back from determinate being to realize that what you saw as a line is actually part of a wider whole. From determinate, to use the analog, you look back at the line that makes up the four, square corners of my coffee cup. If you're looking at it as a 2D object, from determinate being, you see the plane. From being for self, you see the whole cup and its 3D object ness. You know what I mean? And again, it's just an analog. Like it's a I won't even say it's a metaphor. It's just a similar shape that's repeated throughout the system. And you can't talk about one in relation to the other except very indirectly, if that makes any sense. Shit. And now I'm going to have to figure out how to untie that knot to see if that movement of 3 is in capital, or if it's just in chapter 1. I can't remember. Anyway, does any of that help, like, make any of this clear for you guys?
Yeah, also makes it clear what I need to read too.
Yeah, I need to go back through the Hoolgate commentary, the Hegel on being, and just plow through all of quality, because in this last 2 weeks I haven't picked any of this stuff up, except to read like the first 40 paragraphs of the preface, and that, like, he talks about his system in that preface in general, and I don't know, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Like, it plagues you with every paragraph of the phenomenology. And this is what I was telling Alex, Kyle, when you weren't there. I was telling Alex, and he was really resistant to this at first, because I said, look, you read the phenomenology, and any given paragraph, he is relating all of the shapes of consciousness back to this, which hadn't been written yet, right? But he had a rough outline of the triad, as well as the result that he was aiming for, the absolute, as well as the beginning, like where you start, the immediate, right? And was able to talk about, the God, like what's a good category? Like a sentence like the being of perception, or the determinate being of perception, or the becoming of perception, or you see what I mean? And I would point out to him, like, okay, he's defining these states of consciousness, but he's relating them all to a logic, right? Which is necessary prior to even understanding the full shape of what Hegel is doing. One can read the phenomenology and they can get a general idea. But if you wanted to write the phenomenology, you would have to have Hegel's knowledge of the logic, whose shapes he constantly refers back to illuminate experience. And I said, yeah.
Yeah, Holgate even says, it's the phenomenology takes you to the same place, but via the understanding, not through logic.
The full illumination of phenomenology, of the philosophy of right, of capital, for that matter, all require a basic knowledge of those basic logical categories and their shapes, and what a necessity is, what a ground is, so on and so forth. And it strikes me as very counterintuitive that one, like, he gets to the category of ground in the Encyclopedia Logic, right? I think it's like, is it in the second or the third? Is that concept, or is that essence?
It's essence.
Okay, so he talks about ground in essence, and it has an antinomy that is actually coextensive with, right? And uh, in action, he shows you what a ground is before you even talk about the category logically. Like you can even like think of it in the logical argument. Um, but because the absolute idea in our heads is already a whole, right? Everything that determines even the smallest determination, sheer being, is subject to all of those other determinations. But you don't know that yet, not until the end, and you realize that the absolute idea externalizes itself into nature as a shape, as a a brain size shape, right? And every one of the determinations that makes up that firmware, and with the absolute idea, it's just firmware, right? It's just electricity on wires, right? Uh, govern that entire process from beginning to end. Being able to show it in its logical necessity is the only way to account for everything while being fully self-critical without having any extraneous, stuff in the mix, anything unproven, I should say. Clear as mud.
Ah,
Okay.
man. Mud is thinned, but not as.
Yeah. Oh, I know. Yeah, I know. Um, the uh, the I need to get to the end of the Yena passage because I'm just at the point, like right before, like everybody has just left Yena. Okay, everybody, Schelling has just left Jena. Okay, um, yeah. So I'm at our Dr. Hegel, or a little bit after, and so Schelling and Needhammer and Heinrich Eberhard, Gottlieb Paulus, Justus Loder, Friedrich and Gottlieb Hufland, and all the greatest of the Romantics all left the university, basically because Carl August was running it into the ground. You know, the people running Jena University were corrupt, and you know, so a whole bunch of the previous generation left, and the only people who were left are the people who could afford to be there or were there by default: Hegel, Goethe, and Goethe, because he's probably a very rich man at that point, or at least well taken care of. Um, uh, anyway, you get my meaning on that, and so once Schelling is sort of off doing his thing, Hegel, I think, was able to like, okay, let me consolidate what I have, uh, uh, before he leaves, and shortly after this point, Napoleon conquers Jena, and Hegel finishes his Phenomenology of Spirit, famously sending off the final draft to his publishers, with a messenger who has to traverse the French lines. And you think if this didn't make it through the French lines at the time, we wouldn't have this, sitting in our laps. He would have been like, well, shit. I now I have to write something, and it's just going to be a footnote. We got the full Monty, as far as I can tell. So that's exciting. Anyway, it's 10:02. Anything anybody want to talk about, elaborate on? I didn't really move us forward into quantity at all, other than just to give the short summary at the beginning of the thing, because it gives us a way to get back into it.
Right.
So I've got two competing ideas. One is for me to, in a week or maybe two, likely two, to try to read the Hegel commentary on quality in its fullness so that I could talk about it a little bit more zoomed in, to like show all the shapes of the transitions, and talk about them as being the necessary shapes of being and becoming, or if we should just assign the next section of quantity and talk about all that stuff along the way.
I mean, either way, I might go ahead and read the first chapter, quantity, which
Yeah.
is up to right up to quantum. So,
Yeah, same. All right, let's do this. My head is pounding.
oof.
All right. All right, not all of you are reading the commentary, but shit. Okay, I have two possibilities. I could assign page 187 to 199, which is like 12 pages. The main text is like a page and a short paragraph. It's very short, very short. The remarks, on the other hand, are 2.5 pages for the first remark, and then like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages for the second remark. But it's only a remark, right? It's not the main part, right? So if all you do is show up and just read a pure quantity and maybe the first remark, you'll still cover a lot of ground. You know what? Okay, yes. So write this down wherever you are, and I'll write it down later. I'm going to assign pages 187 to 199. That gets us through A, pure quantity, right? B is continuous and discrete magnitude on page 199, which is the next part. So yeah, just 12 pages. I'm going to do my best to try to make it through the commentary in the next couple weeks on quality so that I can talk about that other stuff. But I feel like we're where we can just carry on. We've been through the entire encyclopedia logic. If you have any questions about quantity, especially in this form, what I want you to do is go to pages, or page, it'll just be page. And this is for everyone watching too, if you want to follow along. Go to page, I don't have this thing marked at all. Killing myself here. Yeah. Really, if you have any questions about where we're reading, it's page 157 in the encyclopedia, 99 at the beginning of quantity, and just, I don't know. I mean, you could read all the way to 161 to quantum and just get the full shape, because we've already read it, right? And really, in the science of logic, we're only reading like the first, like, hello? You
Yep.
guys can hear me, right? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, it's keyed to page 157 in the encyclopedia logic, but let's do those 12 pages in the science of logic, which is a microcosm of the whole of quantity. And in the meantime, I'll read up on the commentary, and you guys can read along. It's I think I shared it on the web page, the PDFs of this monster. which I haven't even broken out because I don't want to. It's it was too much money to pick this thing up. I don't even want to break it out. I've been reading it off the PDFs. That gives a really good commentary on every square inch of being. Sound good?
Mhm.
Are we all happy? Great, great.
With that, yeah.
All right. So comrades, we'll adjourn for now, and I'll see you next week. And have a great week. Oh, yes, Doug, congratulations on your part-time gig.
Thanks.
Oh, good.
Freaking awesome. Finally, some good news. I mean, other than the books, obviously. When does that come out? Is that March or April?
The Kautsky should be out in the summer.
Oh, in the summer. Okay. All right.